In 1802, a French emigrant named Eleuthere Irenee du Pont paid $6,740 for 95 acres on the banks of Brandywine Creek, north of Wilmington, Delaware. The land already had a dam and a mill race from an old cotton mill that had burned down in 1797. DuPont brought gunpowder machinery from France and construction blueprints supplied by the French government. Within a year, he had built a powder mill, a Georgian mansion on the hill above the river, and barracks for 30 workers. By 1803, the mill was refining saltpeter for the United States Army. Within a decade, DuPont was the largest gunpowder supplier in the country. By the Civil War, the company produced half the powder used by the Union Army. The complex on the Brandywine grew to 4 separate yards: Eleutherian Mills, Upper Hagley, Lower Hagley, and the Lower Yard. Dozens of buildings connected by underground tunnels where gunpowder moved on horse-drawn narrow-gauge rail. In 119 years of operation, the site suffered 288 explosions. 228 people died. The blast of 1890 was so powerful the DuPont family abandoned the mansion permanently. A second explosion in 1920 finished what was left. Production shut down in 1921. In 1957, the property became the Hagley Museum, and that is when the story that never made it into any guidebook begins. During restoration excavations in the 1950s and 1960s, crews uncovered foundations and underground structures across the entire property. Most matched the DuPont Company records: mills, magazines, storage vaults. But beneath the lowest levels, deeper than any foundation DuPont ever laid, workers found stone chambers, arched openings, and lined passages that did not correspond to any blueprint, any construction document, or any known period of building on the Brandywine. The valley sits on limestone karst, the same geological belt that runs through Pennsylvania and Delaware, the same type of rock that forms natural caves. But these chambers were not natural. The walls were laid, the arches were built, and they sat at a depth that DuPont never reached. This is an investigation into what lies beneath the DuPont estate, below the powder tunnels, why the restoration excavations found structures that match no company record, and at what depth the workers were told to stop digging. To understand what is underneath, you first need to understand what was on top. The DuPont Powder Works on the Brandywine was not a single building, it was an industrial city. At its peak, the complex stretched over 235 acres along both banks of the creek. The layout was dictated by the constant threat of explosion. Each stage of powder production was housed in a separate building, spaced far enough apart that one blast would not trigger another. Stamping mills where the raw ingredients were crushed, rolling mills where they were pressed into cakes, graining mills where the cakes were broken into granules, glazing mills where the granules were polished. Each building connected to the next by underground tunnels and narrow-gauge rail, so that powder never had to be transported on the surface where a spark could reach it. The tunnels were stone-lined, reinforced with granite, and designed to channel any blast upward and away from adjacent structures. This is important. The DuPont tunnels are well documented, engineering drawings survive, construction logs exist. The Hagley Museum archives contain over 1,200 photographs of the powder yards taken during the final decades of operation and during the restoration. Every tunnel, every foundation, every building can be matched to a record. The DuPont Company was meticulous. They documented everything, because in the gunpowder business, knowing exactly what was where could mean the difference between one building exploding and the entire complex going up. So when the restoration crews in the 1950s started excavating and found structures that had no corresponding documentation, the significance was immediate. These were not missing records. The DuPont archive is one of the most complete industrial records in American history. If the company had built something, there would be a drawing, a cost entry, a work order, a letter. The structures beneath the lowest powder tunnels had none of these. They predated the company. They predated the cotton mill that burned in 1797. They predated everything that the official history of the Brandywine Valley acknowledges as having been built on this land. The Brandywine Valley is not ordinary terrain. The creek runs through a formation called the Piedmont, a belt of metamorphic and sedimentary rock stretching from New Jersey through Delaware. Along the Brandywine, the bedrock includes limestone. Limestone dissolves. Rainwater passing through it over thousands of years creates voids, caves, chambers, underground rivers, sinkholes. The entire karst belt is riddled with them. The Lenape people, who inhabited the valley for thousands of years before European contact, had oral traditions about underground spaces along the creek, rooms inside the earth, water that disappeared into stone and emerged elsewhere, places they considered sacred and did not enter. DuPont chose the site for water power, not geology. The dam and millrace were already in place. Gunpowder production happens at surface level. The underground tunnels connecting buildings were shallow, 6 to 10 feet below grade. DuPont had no reason to go deeper, and for 119 years, nobody did. The explosions that ripped through the complex may have done more subsurface damage than anyone realized. 288 blasts, some felt in Wilmington 9 miles away, would have fractured rock, shifted soil, and potentially opened sealed voids stable for centuries. But during the operational years, nobody was looking down. They were too busy trying not to die. The Hagley Museum's restoration began in the late 1950s, under the direction of the Eleutherian Mills Hagley Foundation. The goal was to restore the powder yards to their 19th century appearance, turning an industrial ruin into a living museum of American manufacturing history. This required excavation. Buildings that had been destroyed by explosions and buried under decades of debris had to be uncovered, documented, and in some cases rebuilt. The foundation hired crews who worked with archaeologists and industrial historians to map every structure against the company's own engineering records. For most of the site, the work was straightforward. The DuPont archives told them exactly where every building had stood, what it was made of, how deep its foundation went, and when it was built. The crew would dig, find the foundation, match it to the drawing, and move on. But at several locations across the property, particularly along the lower stretches of the creek where the terrain drops closer to the water table, the excavations went deeper than expected. The crews hit structures below the DuPont foundations, stone walls that continued downward past the level where the company's construction stopped, arched openings in limestone that were clearly worked, not natural, passages lined with fitted stone that led away from the DuPont structures at angles that did not correspond to any tunnel on any drawing. In at least one location, workers uncovered a chamber with a corbelled ceiling, stone walls, and a floor that sat well below anything the DuPont company had ever built on the property. The chamber was partially flooded, which is consistent with its proximity to the water table in a karst valley. But the construction technique, unmortared fitted stone with a corbelled vault, was not consistent with any known American industrial or colonial building practice. It was consistent with techniques found in ancient European and pre-Columbian construction. The excavation records from the Hagley restoration are archived at the Hagley Museum and Library. They are voluminous, detailed, and almost entirely focused on the DuPont era structures. The deeper anomalies are mentioned in passing, notations in field logs, brief descriptions, depths recorded, and then the logs move on to the next DuPont foundation. No separate investigation was conducted. No archaeologist was assigned to study the sub-DuPont structures independently. They were noted, measured, and buried under the restoration. After the DuPont family abandoned the property following the 1890 explosion, a section of the ruined powder yards was acquired by the Crowninshield family, relatives of the DuPonts by marriage. Louise and Frank Crowninshield spent decades building an elaborate garden on top of the industrial ruins. And what they did with the underground structures tells you everything about what they found. The Crowninshields did not fill in the tunnels and chambers. They incorporated them. Frank Crowninshield transformed powder tunnels into garden grottos. He turned old foundations into reflecting pools. He built arches that rose from the wreckage of the powder yards, and he deliberately distressed new stonework with chains and hammers to make it look as old as the ruins it sat on. Industrial saltpeter cauldrons were placed on pedestals as ornaments. During nighttime parties, Louise had the cauldrons filled with oil and set on fire. The Crowninshield garden became a fantastical landscape of ruins, water features, and underground passages that blurred the line between what DuPont had built, what the Crowninshields had added, and what had been there before either family arrived. This is where the trail becomes difficult to follow. The Crowninshields did not document which underground features they found and which they created. Their garden deliberately mixed new construction with old ruins and older structures into a single aesthetic. When the Hagley Museum later catalogued the property, separating DuPont-era tunnels from Crowninshield additions from pre-existing features became nearly impossible. Some researchers believe this blurring was not accidental. The Crowninshields were a prominent family with deep social connections. They would have understood that ancient underground chambers on a famous American estate might attract the wrong kind of attention. By incorporating them into a garden and covering them with their own construction, they made the older structures invisible. You cannot investigate what you cannot distinguish from its surroundings. The garden itself still exists within the Hagley Museum grounds. Visitors walk through it without knowing that some of the grottos they admire may not have been built by the Crowninshields or the DuPonts. They may have been found. The question that matters most is the one the Hagley restoration never answered. How deep do the structures go? The DuPont powder tunnels are shallow, 6 to 10 feet below grade. The foundations of the largest buildings, the rolling mills and stamping mills, extend perhaps 15 to 20 feet into the earth to reach stable rock for bearing. Below that, according to the DuPont archive, there is nothing. But the karst geology of the Brandywine says otherwise. Limestone caves in the Piedmont belt have been documented at depths of 50, 70, over 100 feet. Some are natural, some show evidence of modification. Along the Brandywine specifically, cave surveys conducted in the 20th century have found voids at multiple depths, some flooded, some dry, some partially collapsed. The ground-penetrating radar work that has been done at the Hagley site is limited and largely unpublished. What exists in private research files suggests anomalies below the DuPont construction level at multiple points across the property. Rectangular features, uniform voids, patterns that do not match natural cave formation. The current property management has not authorized comprehensive subsurface surveys. The Hagley Museum's mission is to preserve and interpret the DuPont industrial heritage. Their mandate does not include investigating what was on the site before the DuPonts arrived. Researchers who have requested permission to conduct independent surveys have been declined. The reason given is always the same: preservation of the historic landscape, protection of existing structures, liability concerns. The practical effect is that the depth question remains unanswered. The Hagley Museum sits on 235 acres of karst terrain in a valley where every geological feature suggests a complex underground landscape, and nobody with institutional authority has ever mapped what sits below the DuPont level. Whatever is down there, at the depth where workers were told to stop, remains exactly as it was when the excavation logs noted it and moved on. The Brandywine Valley is one more point on a map that researchers have been building for years. Stone chambers beneath industrial sites, underground structures below colonial foundations, arched passages in karst valleys predating every known occupant. The same pattern appears under Manhattan, where boring logs record cut stone at depths preceding the Dutch. In the stone chambers of New England, sealed from inside before the Puritans. In Kentucky and Tennessee caves, where explorers described rooms that appeared built rather than formed. The DuPont family did not choose the Brandywine by accident. They came for water power. But the site had already been built on. The cotton mill sat on an older foundation. That foundation sat on something older. And below that, in the karst that dissolves and reveals and conceals, there are chambers nobody built in the last 500 years. 288 explosions in 119 years. Anyone could have opened a void, exposed a chamber. The workers who survived and returned to rebuild would have seen what the blasts revealed. And the company kept meticulous records of everything above a certain depth. Below that depth, the archive goes silent. The DuPont Powder Works operated on the Brandywine for 119 years, 288 explosions, 228 dead. Every building, every tunnel, every foundation documented in one of the most complete industrial archives in American history. And beneath all of it, below the lowest tunnel, below the deepest foundation, below the level where the company's records stop and the geology begins, there are structures that nobody has explained. Stone chambers with corbelled ceilings in a valley where corbelled construction has no documented history. Arched passages that lead away from the DuPont complex at angles that do not match any company blueprint. Fitted walls at depths that predate the cotton mill, the colonial settlement, and every known occupant of the Brandywine Valley. The Crowninshields found them and turned them into a garden. The Hagley restoration crews found them and wrote a line in a field log. The museum that controls the property has declined every request for comprehensive subsurface survey. 235 acres of karst terrain on a limestone creek in Delaware, sitting on a geological formation that dissolves and opens and reveals whatever is inside it. And the total archaeological investigation of what exists below the DuPont level is a handful of notations in a restoration log that almost nobody has read. The powder is gone, the explosions have stopped, the dynasty has moved on, but the ground under the Brandywine is still limestone, it is still dissolving, and whatever sits at the depth where the workers were told to stop is still there, in the dark, in the water, waiting for the next thing that opens the earth above it. Subscribe if you want more of this. The next investigation goes deeper than a powder mill. It goes beneath the most expensive real estate on Earth, and the geologist who mapped it all never published what he found.